The early 1950s was really the golden age of baseball cards. The classic Bowman and Topps sets in the early 1950s marked the pinnacle of baseball card design. This is when baseball cards stopped being just cheap pieces of cardboard and really started becoming actual works of art. And the surge in the popularity of baseball card collecting in the 1980s was mostly because people were rediscovering the amazing cards of their childhood. But that golden age did not last long, and the question that we're going to look into today is why. In particular, why did Bowman lose that war? What happened to end that brief golden age of baseball cards in the early 50s? Why didn't this last longer? Back in 1951, Bowman's supremacy as the premier creator of baseball cards was well established and largely unquestioned. By 1954, however, Bowman was struggling and was losing market share fast. Though it's a really nice looking set, 1955 Bowman wound up being the last set the company ever issued. By 1956, Topps was the only major manufacturer of baseball cards left in the United States. And the thing is, this did not have to happen. Now, I've been interested in this story since I was a little kid. I used to sit around reading baseball card books all the time, right? I'm not even joking with you. I figured that right now is probably the best time for me to really dig into this and figure out what really happened. And the thing is, if you're interested in stories like these that people don't usually tell, especially on YouTube, please consider supporting me and supporting this project. In fact, I've got 3 different options here for you. So the first is the most obvious. You can become a member here on YouTube. This gives you access to videos as soon as I make them, usually a week or more before they're officially released. Second, you can consider supporting me on my Baseball Replay Journal blog. There's always a link in the description to every video. And third, you can consider supporting me on Patreon, where there are a lot of additional benefits, including full access to my extensive sports broadcast and research collections. I've got about 8.5 terabytes of files available through Patreon right now if you're interested, including some stuff that isn't easy to find, and there's more coming. And regardless of what you choose, every little bit helps. Now, I love doing this, and I want to keep telling these stories that nobody else talks about. Anyway, Bowman's fall from the top was sudden, and it was dramatic, and it didn't happen for the reasons that you think. I know this because so many people come up with certain reasons in the books that I read, and they're not really accurate. In fact, just about every opinion I've read on this subject is problematic. Now, most people who talk about the fall of Bowman assume that kids just didn't like the cards. The theory here is that Bowman's lead in the industry was slipping and that Topps was easily able to overcome it. Now, to be blunt with you, it is obvious the 1952 Topps was a major step above what Bowman was doing at the time. I mean, even the backs of the 1952 Topps cards were superior. Topps really went all out to make the best quality product that it could. But you see, the problem with this argument is that the quality of Bowman's card design improved as the years went on. It didn't get worse. It's not that Bowman was paying no attention to card quality whatsoever. In fact, Bowman's 1953 set is arguably the greatest baseball card set of all time. 1953 Topps is a really underappreciated and underrated set with artistic card fronts. The backs of 1953 Topps cards have tons and tons of stuff just to look at. In my opinion, these are among the best card backs in the history of baseball cards. But Bowman's 1953 cards are simply better. I mean, there's no question about it. Topps might have had the better backs, but these backs are still superior to anything I've seen recently in the hobby. So I know that opinions on stuff like, how beautiful this card is and stuff, it's all subjective, but you're not going to find a serious collector who doesn't love 1953 Bowman color. And this was not just a 1953 thing either. There is a reason why the 1954 Bowman Ted Williams card is iconic, even if it might not be quite as dramatic as those 1953 Bowman color cards. Personally, I prefer that Bowman card to either one of the 1954 Topps Ted Williams cards. And yeah, I know that these photos are in poor condition, but I still prefer the Bowman even if the Topps cards are in great condition. Of course, the Topps cards had the better backs in 1954, there's no question about that. So it's incredible when you compare the backs of 1954 Topps baseball cards to the crap that the company put out in years like 1988, 1989, or even today. It goes to show you how important competition is in the hobby. If you let a company like Topps or Fanatics or whatever have this monopoly, the quality is going to go downhill right away. And today we're really missing out. 1955 Topps was another one of those work of art sets. Considering the variety of colors on these cards and the shading job, I would say that these were pretty expensive to print. But Bowman gave us these infamous wood border television cards that year, and this is one of the most famous designs in baseball card history. In other words, you can't tell me that Bowman lost because these cards don't look good. So if you're watching this, if you're looking at these cards and you're wondering what happened over all these years, I'll go ahead and show you here. The thing is that these baseball card companies have never quite learned that what the customers really want are cards that are sort of works of art. For the most part, the collectors of baseball cards are really not that interested in boring photographs. The greatest sets of all time have actually had like some art flavor to them. For example, there's a reason why everybody knows about the famous American Tobacco 1909 to 1911 set, the old T206. Nobody would care at all about this set if it were simply pictures like some of the other sets of the time. I mean, sure, this Ramley Cigarettes T204 set might have actual pictures of the players, but the black and white pictures are no match for the cards with art, even if you're talking about a notorious player. Anyway, this pattern continues throughout the history of baseball cards. In fact, if you look closely at the evolution of the cards, it becomes obvious that the collectors really like the cards that are very nicely done and are very artistic. The Depression-era 1933 Gowdy Gum set was famous largely for its excellent design and artwork. Like T206, these cards were full-color artistic renditions. These are paintings made based on black and white photographs. In contrast, the 1933 DeLong Gum set used black and white photos over a color background, and the set has never really been popular. This set looks just tacky compared to what Gowdy did. Anyway, the interesting thing here is that Bowman baseball cards were based largely on this very understanding that it's the art that sold the cards. Art worked better than photographs, and this lesson was obvious early on. The 1939 Play Ball set was actually a Bowman set. Gum Incorporated was the name of a company owned and managed by Warren Bowman, who had already made a name for himself by the late 1930s. While the photographs here are nice, the obvious problem is that the cards are boring and, of course, they're black and white. This is particularly notable when you consider how colorful the packaging was. This was a serious missed opportunity. Now, Play Ball got it right by 1941, but then the war stole the company's thunder. And it would take years before we would see another carefully designed set with good artwork. Plus, there were only 72 cards in the 1941 Play Ball set, and I mean, Pearl Harbor wasn't until December that year, right? So that's not what happened to stop more cards from being printed. Now, by modern standards, of course, this is totally unacceptable. The thing is, though, that Bowman really learned how important that artistic approach is when he dipped his toe into the non-sport side of things a couple of years earlier. And this is one of the most famous sets of all time that I'm betting that most of you have likely forgotten about. The 1938 Horrors of War set by Gum Incorporated is one of the most important card sets of all time. Bowman designated this as a set illustrating the horrors of war abroad in hopes of preserving the peace, and of course, he was unsuccessful in the end. These cards were extremely detailed artistic renditions of Japan's invasion of China. The attention to detail in these cards is just top-notch, and these cards were used as a powerful propaganda tool. So rumor has it that even President Roosevelt used these cards at some point in time to talk about why America should stay out of the war. I don't know, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you probably don't, believe me on that, but that's up to you, whatever your understanding of history is. Regardless, that Horrors of War set is a fantastic set. It was a fantastic idea, and the excellent artwork for this set made the point much more clearly than any photograph ever could. There were later Bowman sets with a similar propaganda bend to them, such as this 1941 Home Defense set. These particular cards were distributed up in Canada. However, there were also similar sets in the United States, including this one focusing on training for national defense. So instead of baseball players, now you can buy cards with military formation instructions on the back. Anyway, the cards and gum always cost a penny each, which was the standard rate until inflation took over in the mid-1970s. And honestly, even the packages and the wax plaques were works of art themselves. So the lesson that Bowman learned from this is that investing in the aesthetic value of these cards really pays off. That Horrors of War set was popular in part because of the shocking subject matter. Yeah, I mean, you've got cards that have like people who are like impaled and stuff. It's pretty grotesque. But it really got that point across with the dramatic and amazing artwork that bordered on propaganda. And like I said, photographs just simply cannot have the same effect. We should probably think of 1948 Bowman as a test set. This is sort of a proof of concept to see if people wanted to buy baseball cards again. The cards were small, of course, just like most of the cards that were printed and sold in the 1930s. By 1949, the color had returned to Bowman's cards. I suppose that Bowman's decision was at least partially inspired by the all-color set that Leaf put out in early 1949. But Leaf's cards had quality issues, especially in the coloring process. The Bowman cards also have problems, but they look a little bit more natural. And by 1950, Bowman's cards looked like bona fide works of art. Anyway, my point in saying all of this is that the cards themselves and the design behind the cards themselves, that likely was not Bowman's biggest problem in the early 1950s. Now, if you're going to put the blame on a design flaw, you should be looking at the packaging, not the cards themselves. And nobody looks at this. I swear, I've read so many freaking books and articles about this. Nobody thinks about the packaging, right? I mean, duh, obviously. Anyway, this is where Topps had Bowman beaten hands down. And once you look at it, you'll see. Most people don't actually realize this, but 1948 Bowman was sold in packages that said play ball on them. Perhaps we should refer to this as another play ball set. Anyway, by 1949, Bowman was calling its product baseball bubblegum with no mention of the company name anywhere. This was the case for the late 40s and the early 50s. Bowman didn't really get its brand name out there at all. Now, this is where the real marketing lesson comes in. I've never been to a marketing class, right? I mean, I'm sort of a grade A idiot when it comes to how to do this stuff. In fact, if you look at the design behind these projects, thumbnails and stuff, you'll see that. I'm just making this up as I go. But one thing is for certain, and I can see this, Bowman did a really, really poor job in marketing its own product. 1951 Topps cards came with awful taffy and were advertised as baseball candy. This 2 cards for 1 cent pack is probably the most famous pack variation from that set. But Topps went all out for its 1952 baseball card packs. It used eye-pleasing colors, the giant-size advertisement, and most importantly, that big Topps logo on top. The package was designed to get kids to recognize that Topps brand. This is likely in hopes that the kids would ask for Topps bubblegum cards at the drugstore counter. Meanwhile, Bowman simply called its product baseball and bubblegum and didn't mention the name of the brand anywhere. I mean, not even the boxes followed a good branding strategy. Now, I know that all of this talk about like the market and everything probably sounds silly when you realize that we're talking about cards and bubblegum that was designed for kids. And that's really what the market was in the 1950s. This wasn't grown-ups, this was kids. However, the lesson here does apply to this day. So for example, if you clicked on this video and you're watching it, you likely saw something interesting or something you liked in like the thumbnail or the description or title or whatever. In other words, the package is not just as important as the product, it's actually more important than the product. And that, the package, is where Bowman lost its empire. I mean, as nice as 1953 Topps looks, you can't seriously tell me the kids were not impressed by 1953 Bowman. These cards are simply iconic and will likely always be remembered as the best of the best, the greatest set of all time. But the packs only said baseball stars on them, no brand name, not even an eye-pleasing color combination. Even the boxes were just play ball bubblegum, the same as they were back in 1948. The 1953 Topps wax pack design just might be the best in the company's history, and notice the prominent Topps name on top. Believe it or not, the colors and the branding really does make a difference. The thing is that Topps had already bitten off a huge chunk of Bowman's market presence by 1953. 1953 Bowman Color was an amazing set, no doubt about it. That's why I say you can't tell me that it was Bowman's design flaws that hurt it, right? I was reading actually in this book right here, The Bubblegum Card War by good old Dean Hanley from Dean's Cards. He's talking about how, oh, well, kids like the Topps cards better, so they bought more of them. That's a bunch of hogwash, right? 1953 Bowman Color was like the most amazing set of all time. I mean, you'd have to be blind not to see it, right? But the thing is that Bowman's sales in 1952 were down 15% from 1951, and by 1953, it was less than a third of what it had been in 1951. They were selling almost $1 million a year, and they went down to like right around $300,000 in 1953. Now, that's got to be because of marketing and packaging. This is the only thing that makes sense. Now, I do know that Bowman figured this out eventually because the company started to make changes, but it was too little too late. Bowman finally used its company's name on its 1954 packs and regained quite a bit of market share as a result. The boxes and the packs had this really satisfying green color instead of that white that you just saw in 1953 Bowman. Even the one-set wrappers were a huge improvement over the past few years. And 1955 packs were another step in the right direction, though I'm not a huge fan of the yellow color here. And notice the 9 cards for 5 cents. This shows just how desperate Bowman was to regain its lost market presence. Anyway, as you can tell, I could talk about like just the design behind these packs and these cards for hours on end if you guys let me, but I won't bore you that much. The story here, though, is that Bowman failed in part because Topps did a better job of advertising its own product. This isn't just about like the artwork or the card size. Bowman did change all of that to keep up. What Bowman did not realize is that kids wanted packs with dark greens and dark blues and dark reds, not white packs that looked really cheap and unprofessional. Now, the second factor in Bowman's demise had to do with this court battle that it was waging against Topps while all of this was going on. You see, starting in 1948, Warren Bowman took advantage of the lack of competition in the market and started to sign players up to exclusive baseball card contracts. Now, this lawsuit was prominent enough that it received an article in the very first issue of Sports Illustrated, even though the case really had long been settled before the issue came out. The great irony, of course, is that the baseball bubble trouble could have been avoided if it wasn't for Bowman's pesky insistence on those exclusive contracts. Now, exclusive contracts give birth to monopolies. Monopolies are the biggest problem in the hobby today. You already know this, right? It's ridiculous for freaking Fanatics, which was not even a card company, to have the official licenses for all the leagues. Honestly, this should not be allowed. My opinion is that the major sports leagues should not be allowed to pick only one single exclusive licensee, whether it's for like baseball cards or for clothes or for video games or whatever. This artificially will depress the demand for these products. It's done chiefly, by the way, to prevent the players' associations from getting more money, because as you know, if you have baseball card sets that don't show the logos and the uniforms, nobody wants to buy them. Why don't they want the association to have more money? Well, in baseball, it was the money from baseball card sets that funded the strike war fund that led to the 1994 player strike. Anyway, worst of all, exclusive contracts tend to lead to extremely expensive court battles like the one that Fanatics is facing right now from Panini, and this is the way that Bowman decided to go. Now, the thing you have to understand is that chewing gum is really easy to make. In fact, William Wrigley, a name that you've probably heard of, once said that anybody can make bubble gum. The only trick is to figure out how to sell it. Baseball gum cards go back to the 19th century, and this 1909 Dockman and Sunset is a good early example of gum cards. The idea here was to compete with the cigarette cards of the day, except that these were specifically geared to children, who of course were more interested in chewing gum. And apparently some of the cards came with a Cracker Jack knockoff product as well. So the idea at that time seemed to have been to use the cards to sell the candy. Now, originally, the cards came with cigarettes because the cigarette packages needed like a stiff piece of cardboard in there to stop them from crumbling while being transported. I'm talking both about the packaging itself and the cigarettes that were inside. Eventually, though, because these cards were colored and it was made collectible and stuff, the market's attention was fixated on the cards more than on the cigarettes, and the cards started to sell the product. That's the reason why Goudy gum ended up being so successful. I mean, obviously, chewing gum wasn't all that important if you were in the middle of the Great Depression, but gum combined with a card of everybody's favorite sport was something else entirely. Since chewing gum and bubble gum were basically the same flavors everywhere, having the right baseball cards could be enough of an incentive to get kids to buy your brand. The problem, though, is that the extensive competition cut into profits, and Bowman knew this because he watched what happened to Goudy gum in the 1930s, and then he started competing against them himself. I mean, 1934 Goudy is not a horrible set, though it didn't sell anywhere near as well as the 1933 set. Goudy's biggest problem was this famous Diamond Star set that was first sold in 1934. Goudy couldn't do anything to prevent these cards from being made since it had no exclusive right over the names and likenesses of the players. Now, technically speaking, Goudy was still in the market when Play Ball came around in 1939 with these postcard-sized trading cards. The experiment wasn't very successful, however, in part because Goudy only made 48 of these cards. Bowman's first baseball card set featured small and unattractive black and white pictures, sure. However, Bowman had the good sense to make over 160 cards and was aggressive at marketing the product. So Bowman realized that Gowdy could not do anything to stop the competition, and he kept that in mind when he went back to the hobby, the industry after the war. He started to sign up players to exclusive contracts right away. These were contracts that specified that the players could not sign an additional contract with any other chewing gum company. They would earn $10 for signing and then $90 if they stayed on the Major League roster for like a month, and then if they signed the next year, it'd be another $100. And that's where the money started rolling in because it was cheap now to sign these players up, and Bowman was making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just selling the bubblegum cards. As we know from contemporary court documents, Bowman's revenue from all of this bubblegum approached $1 million in 1951, which was more than double the best year Gowdy Gum had ever had. It helped that the cards looked nice, of course, but the real key here was that exclusive contract. Now, Topps entered the baseball card market that year with that famous 1951 red back, blue back set. Forgive me for saying this, but these cards are really unattractive and are a great example of how not to make baseball cards. I mean, even the backs look like garbage. Even Appa had better cards in 1951 than this. Now remember that Topps sold its cards with taffy in 1951. That technically did not violate the exclusive contracts that Bowman had created for all of its players. But the taffy was awful and kids just didn't buy the product. And so Topps did one of those you only live once things where it started selling bazooka bubblegum with the cards instead, and it basically dared Bowman to sue them. So, for example, Topps managed to sign Willie Mays to a contract to print this beautiful card in 1952. Bowman also had a great looking card for Mays that year and technically had an exclusive contract with the Say Hey Kid. This 1952 Bowman Mickey Mantle card is easily the most iconic of the set and would have been one of the most iconic cards of all time under normal circumstances. The problem, of course, is that it is overshadowed by the most iconic baseball card of all time. Anyway, I could go on. There was a problem here, and so Bowman took Topps to court. Bowman had to do so to protect its bread and butter. But in hindsight, for Bowman, all of that fighting in court was likely a mistake. Now, things were complicated here since Topps had gone ahead and gotten contracts with every single one of the over 400 players that appeared in its 1952 set. The problem, of course, is that Topps had signed a number of players who had exclusive contracts already with Bowman. It's not entirely clear that Topps knew about this ahead of time or even that the players realized that those contracts were actually exclusive. Alright, the Topps legal argument here seems really bizarre to me. It's something about players not being able to really sign their rights to exclusive publicity over to a company, and this is all on the basis of a previous established right to privacy. Topps actually won this case in federal district court, which prompted Bowman to appeal. And it was in that successful appeal by Bowman that the famous right of publicity was established. This is a legal concept that apparently remains significant to this day. Now the key here is that Bowman actually won this case. A lot of people forget about this part. Topps did not win in court in the end, it lost. In fact, 1953 Topps was significantly smaller because Topps could no longer print cards for players who had that exclusive contract with Bowman, and as you probably already know, there were 6 cards that were never even printed because Topps likely discovered that Bowman already had the contract. Now, you've got to remember that some players specifically signed contracts that were not exclusive. Mickey Mantle, for example, had cards in both sets in 1953. And it would have been awful if he couldn't have been part of an iconic card like this one. But that's got to make you wonder why in the world Bowman could not have just agreed to non-exclusive contracts and competed instead on the power of its packaging and cards. Maybe part of it is because it had no name recognition because of the bad packaging. Anyway, that's what Bowman's biggest mistake was, even though it won the lawsuit. The company was so fixated on making sure that its contracts were exclusive that it wound up spending much more in legal fees than it should have, and this was money the company did not have. I mean, its legal fees exceeded $100,000 a year, and sales of Bowman cards were only about $300,000 total in 1953. This is a huge drop-off from 1951. I mean, naturally, it was important to sign as many players to contracts as possible, but the insistence on exclusivity wound up costing a lot more than it was worth. Of course, in the end, the players didn't care one way or another about which company won so long as they got paid. This is what we call a Pyrrhic victory. This is a victory that cost you so much that it winds up leading you to defeat in the long run. Bowman won the battle but lost the war as a result of this victory. But there's one more factor here that everybody forgets about. The thing is that Warren Bowman was sort of a business genius, and yeah, this drunken ridiculousness is the best picture I can find of him. According to this biography in a 1937 issue of Time magazine, Bowman entered into the gum world completely by accident and wound up revolutionizing it. Bowman's Bloney brand barely survived the battles of the 1930s, however, and it wasn't really until he started dabbling in those horrors of war cards that his sales finally stabilized. Of course, the string of former spouses that Bowman left in his wake wound up taking a bunch of his fortune from him. Now, Bowman had a great year in 1951, and apparently Warren Bowman figured that this was the right time to sell his company, right when he knew that the company was about to enter into a massive lawsuit against its biggest competitor. This is where the downfall starts. Bowman sold his company in April 1952. This is likely not long after that famous 1952 Bowman set was first sold. Now, 1952 Bowman is legitimately a great baseball card set, and seriously, I will defend the honor of 1953 Bowman color to my dying day. But the new company in charge, Halen Laboratories, did not have the experience that Bowman had in the gum business or in the baseball card business. My guess is that their greenness, their lack of knowledge is what hurt them the most. Maybe that's why the packaging for Bowman's cards did not change much at all for so many years. Now, Halen Laboratories did the best that they could, and I still think the 1955 Bowman is an underrated set. Sure, it's nowhere near as epic or dramatic as the 1953 set. In fact, even the similarly designed 1966 Topps/OPC hockey set has better artwork than 1955 Bowman. But you shouldn't think that Bowman gave up because its 1955 set was awful or anything like that. Bowman's last stand, by the way, was not that 1955 baseball set. No, it was a football set that came out later that year. This is where it became clear that the company just wasn't going to last. Topps had dipped its toe into the football card market back in 1951 with this Topps Magic set. Bowman had an exclusive contract with the NFL, so Topps made college player cards. The set was an absolute failure commercially. I mean, 1951 Bowman football just looks better. But once again, the Bowman packs looked kind of generic. Anyway, Topps didn't come back to football cards until 1955, and that's where it discovered just how weak Bowman really was. 1955 Bowman football is one of my least favorite designs of all time. The halo effect looks really weird. Why couldn't they show the field, the sky, the stands, and stuff like that behind the players? Meanwhile, Topps had a kind of ridiculous all-American set with black and white photos and colorized stuff. Topps combined historic star players with modern stars, and it actually worked. And in hindsight, it's amazing that this approach worked. Back when sports cards were made for kids and not old guys with beards like me, it was a horrible business move to make cards for guys who had long since retired, or in the case of Knute Rockne, who had already passed away. But Topps took a chance on this, and it worked out in the end. Of course, Topps had the better looking packs, plus that famous 9 cards for 5 cents deal. I wonder why we don't see those these days. Bowman remembered to put the name of the company on the packs, which is good, but this yellow design just doesn't work. If you were a kid in 1955, you almost certainly wanted the Topps packs more than the Bowman packs. Anyway, Bowman was swept up into a merger in late 1955, and it wound up being owned by Connolly Containers Incorporated. Now, this was a company with absolutely no interest in trading cards or bubblegum, and its corporate bosses took one look at Bowman's sagging sales records and decided to just pull the plug on the whole thing. And that was the end of the bubblegum card wars. In the end, Topps paid about $200,000 for all of the Bowman contracts, plus the rights to the name, the printing presses, the gum stuff, and so on. It was kind of a tragic and a sudden end to a great period in baseball card history. Topps did eventually bring the Bowman brand back starting in 1989, as most of you know. And of course, that Bowman brand name does live on to this day, though it's nothing like what it once was. That classic 1953 Bowman color design has been imitated many times over the years, though nobody's quite gotten close to its majesty and legend. The best attempt was this 1975 SSPC set, but the problem is that the photography is missing that special soft touch. Unfortunately, we probably will never again see cards with the same artistic brilliance as those early 1950s cards. And the worst thing of all is that this competition really could have continued. I mean, Bowman had poor marketing. It decided to throw money it didn't have at a wild court battle, and then it had some bad luck in terms of those corporate mergers. But it is absolutely not true that Bowman lost this war because his cards were worse quality than the Topps cards or were somehow uglier. Bowman's cards from the early 1950s still stand the test of time to this day. The real culprit was poor decision making at the top of the company.